One of my absolute favorite topics to talk about in all of One Piece is the future Straw Hat vs Blackbeard pirate matchups. Because while some of these matchups seem pretty guaranteed, like Usopp vs Van Augur for example, others are much less obvious. And the one thing that I've held true for all of my videos on these fights so far is that each of them has to go deeper than simply having two people with similar roles on the crew, or matching aesthetics, or commander ranks, or what have you. All of these fights should involve opposing dreams or even backstories that show they're all two sides of the same coin. But the Straw Hats are obviously on the right side of that coin. And so today, I want to break down the matchup that I foresee happening between my favorite character in the story, Brook, and perhaps the most mysterious Blackbeard crew member, Lafitte the Demon Sheriff. Now, some of you may recall that I did a video a couple years ago now on Brook fighting Vasco Shot, but I have officially and confidently changed my guess to Lafitte. And as for who will be fighting Vasco instead, that will be the topic of a future video, so make sure to subscribe for that one. But why Brook and Lafitte? Well, for starters, just take a look at these two guys. I know I just got done saying that aesthetics aren't everything for these matchups, but both of these guys have canes, they both wear top hats and wear nicer clothes. Lafitte's even sporting a purple mini Doflamingo scarf now in the post time skip, which matches Brook's orange one pretty well. And Lafitte is a tap dancer, which pairs perfectly with Brook's music since they're both kind of like entertainers. It's hard to deny some of the similarities here, and even when you consider their roles as pirates, it's also kinda similar, because Lafitte is Blackbeard's chief of staff, which is usually a moniker used for the number 2 person in an organization. Other examples of this might be Sabo with the Revolutionaries, or even Kabaji with Buggy's crew, even though that may have changed with the inception of the Cross Guild. And while Brook isn't the number 2 on the Straw Hats, he was on the Rum Bar Pirates, and he was even the one chosen to take over as captain after Yorkie's presumed death from that disease. So both Brook and Lafitte somewhat have experience in positions of leadership on a crew, even if they haven't always been the captain. Plus, both of these characters are kind of stealth or infiltration focused. I mean, Lafitte somehow snuck into Marie-Joie without anyone noticing so that he could recommend Blackbeard for a warlord position. And he's also been absent more than any other Blackbeard pirate, including their crew's introduction, and even recently during Egghead, where he's the only pirate that we didn't see during that arc somewhere. Meanwhile, Brook was the MVP of Whole Cake Island because of his sneakiness. He not only got into the Poneglyph room, but he also stole the rubbings and hid them before Big Mom found him, and then finally he capped it off with breaking the Mother Carmel photo while nobody was looking. But even with all of those similarities being said, it's still somehow just the beginning of these two characters' potential ties to one another, because they're also both originally from the West Blue, and they each had a separate life before ever becoming a pirate that was sort of tied to law enforcement or the military. For Brook, he was the convoy leader of a battle fleet for a certain kingdom which has yet to be named. Now, I would almost assume that this is the place he was born in 90 years ago if I had to guess, and I do have a great theory to share on what island that might be in just a few minutes. But as for Lafitte, he's known as the Demon Sheriff for a reason, because he was quite literally a sheriff on the police force in the West Blue, but he was exiled from his country after being excessively cruel and violent. This sort of reminds me of Shiryu's origins a little bit as well, where he was a jailer and Impelled Down before being jailed for taking down too many of his inmates unnecessarily. So I think this theme of being overly violent could be a pretty consistent thing among the Blackbeard crew. I mean, Katarina Devon hunts the faces of pretty women, Vasco Shot is a mega creep, Doc Q passes out apple bombs to people, and who knows what some of the others might be doing. But regardless, this could all set up a potential connection between Brook and Lafitte that goes deeper than we expect. Like, what if Lafitte was born in the same country as Brook? Or maybe it's just a country that's nearby that could have even went to war with Brook's country, meaning they're kind of enemies from their prior lives. And I think this idea gets even more interesting when you take into account what the real-life pirate Lafitte was all about. Now, there were technically two of them, Jean and his older brother Pierre Lafitte, and there's even a bar named after them in New Orleans, Louisiana, which I have actually been to before. I was actually there the night that chapter 1043 dropped, which is the one where Luffy first ever awakened his fruit, so that was kinda cool to experience. But the one that we need to focus on here is Jean Lafitte, because he ran a big-time smuggling operation in New Orleans, and then even helped General Andrew Jackson defend the city during the War War of 1812, where Jackson later paid tribute to their efforts. And then the Lafitte's became spies for the Spanish during the Mexican War of Independence, where afterward he founded a colony that brought in millions of dollars per year in stolen goods, which is kind of insane if you take inflation into account, since that was over 200 years ago. And there's also even a story that he rescued Napoleon, of all people, from exile, although there isn't much evidence. So this guy obviously lived quite a crazy life, and he's probably one of the more well-known real-life pirates in history. So if Oda is gonna base a One Piece character off of him, he probably has big plans for him, and maybe there's some important parallels we can draw here. Because what's really peculiar about Jean Lafitte is that his birth and death are very obscure, with historians not being sure whether he was born in France or the Caribbean, and whether he died in 1823 or 1875. Yes, a 52-year gap. Now, there's probably a lot of theories that you could pull from this already, and I highly recommend this video by Hidden Island if you want to hear a different take than I'm going to share today. But what I glean from this information is that perhaps like Brook, Lafitte was also kind of granted a second life somehow. I mean, like I said, there's a 52-year gap in the real Lafitte's supposed death dates, and guess how long it's been since Brook's crew first made it into the Florian Triangle and died? 52 years. What if Brook and Lafitte both died at the same time 52 years ago, and both were able to start their life anew afterward? And perhaps Brook is one of the only people left in the world who will even recognize who Lafitte truly is, because he's been around long enough to remember what was going on in the West Blue all those years ago. I mean, Sengoku recognized Lafitte as the demon sheriff right away, so I assume that the policeman part of his career was likely after this first death. But perhaps the early days were a lot different. I mean, what if Brook and Lafitte had faced off in the past when Brook led the convoy of his home kingdom? I mean, imagine these two getting to have a redo of their battle from maybe 60 or 70 years ago. But if that's true, then we should probably talk about what kingdom Brook might be from. Now, as I said earlier in the video, this hasn't been revealed to us yet in the story, but there is a great theory that I remember from a YouTuber named Dawn of the World, where she gave a very compelling argument that Brook is from an island known as Taroa. And I will leave a link below to her video in case you want the full scoop, but basically, Taroa is an island in the West Blue that we've actually only heard of one time in the story, which was in the Saba Odi auction house, because the first person that was to be auctioned off was a fellow named Byron, who hails from this country of Taroa. So you're probably wondering at this point, how does this prove that Brook is from there? Well, Byron was said to be a musician from a distinguished family, and that he could play any instrument. And not only that, his attire is very similar to Brook's as well, with all the fancy clothes and whatnot. And to cap it all off, Mr. Disco even mentioned that Byron made wine, which is a pretty fitting connection to Brook, who introduced all of us to Bink Sake. So the running idea here is that maybe Taroa is a whole country of musicians, and that's where Brook originally gained his expertise. And now the unfortunate thing about Taroa is that this information I've told you is literally all we know about that country, so we don't have a ton to build off of here. But what I did realize is that if Byron is from a distinguished family from that country, and Brook led a convoy in his home country early on, what if Brook actually worked for Byron's parents or grandparents back in the day? And in case you were wondering why Brook didn't speak up or mention that he was from Taroa when Byron was on stage, or that he maybe even knew Byron's family, well, that's because Brook was not at the auction house by that point. The Straw Hats arrived shortly afterward, so there may be a little sleight of hand there from Oda in terms of keeping this all a secret from the crew. And so going back to the idea that Brook and Lafitte actually fought against each other before in their prior lives, I wonder if that fight was a result of a war between their home countries. Like maybe the land of musicians has a rivalry with the land of tap dancers, which might sound a little corny at first, but remember, we do have a 1,000-year-long war between the long legs and long arms, which is kind of similar since they're like diametrically opposing groups. So I guess we have a little bit of precedent for that. Plus, you know, Brook was sent to Harahitania in the time skip, which was a country in turmoil because of the Long Arm tribe. So maybe Oda is already slowly setting this up where Brook's country had a similar past to Harahitania thanks to their war versus Lafitte's country. It could even be a situation where Brook's convoy led to the downfall of Lafitte's country, and that's what necessitated Lafitte starting a new life in the first place. And probably probably taking on a new appearance along the way, which is why nobody recognizes him now. And while the idea of Lafitte changing his appearance and starting a new life might seem kind of convenient here, it is something we've seen in One Piece multiple times before. I mean, remember Denjiro being so mad that he changed his face? Or hell, even Duval had his face rearranged by Sanji at one point. And you know, we also had the whole Captain Kuro situation back in Syrup Village, where he faked his own death so he could stop being a pirate and live on as Clawhador, where he could attempt to take Kaya's fortune. And you know, that fake death was aided by some hypnotism, which Lafitte is able to use, and we're going to get back onto that in just a minute. But maybe this first death that Lafitte had is why he's so pale white now. I mean, Brook turned pure white after dying because he became a skeleton, so Lafitte could maybe mirror that somehow as well. And you know, he should be around 90 years old now in actuality if this whole theory is true, which he doesn't look that old obviously, so something had to happen at some point to make this all work. And I think the easiest answer is just that it's a result of his devil fruit, which again would mirror Brook perfectly since he's also only alive thanks to his fruit. But now the question is, what fruit would Lafitte have exactly? Because as of the time of recording this video, Lafitte is the only Blackbeard pirate that hasn't had his devil fruit revealed yet, which only adds to this increased emphasis on what those powers may be. So I'm going to take a stab at guessing what abilities he may have, and I'm actually going to list a few different options because admittedly, this is a really hard fruit to guess. Because let's first consider what we already know about Lafitte's powers, which is that he can hypnotize people and develop these white bird wings. That's why you've probably heard so many theories about Lafitte being Hattori. Or maybe you've heard theories about Lafitte having some kind of mythical siren zone fruit, which in case you don't already know about that, sirens were half bird, half woman creatures that lured sailors to their death with their music, which again would be kind of perfect in a battle against Brook, who's probably even better at music. But what's special about sirens is that their music would basically hypnotize people so they'd crash their boat or just jump overboard or what have you. And while Brook's music hasn't had that level of control yet, we have seen that it can impact people's emotions. And Brook's even told us directly that it does because it affects your very soul. But there is one caveat that I want to make here, which is that Lafitte's hypnotism powers and his bird wings could be completely different things. And part of me does think that this is just something Oda would do to throw us off his trail. Because do you remember Django, the weird hypnotist guy from Syrup Village who ended up becoming a marine? Well, his hypnotism powers came from a mushroom that he ate, which was growing on his chin, meaning it was not from a devil fruit. So we could have a situation here where Lafitte has a more basic bird zone fruit, but with hypnotism powers from another source. And I think this Django connection is really appropriate to Lafitte because not only did he help his captain fake his death to start a second life, which is already really important, but Django is based off one of the best entertainers of all time in Michael freaking Jackson. And we know that this is true because Django is always doing the moonwalk, and that's kind of a good parallel to Lafitte, who is a tap dancer. And now while Michael had tons of moves in his repertoire, tap dancing was surely one of them. There's a ton of clips you can find online of him doing so. So this all shows that dancing and hypnotism are already sort of linked in a way. And it makes me think that the bird wings are probably their own separate thing. And you know, going back to Captain Kuro for just a second, he's a really fitting parallel here too because he was someone who was incredibly fast, especially at that point in the story. Oda basically said that Kuro used Soru before anyone else, it's just that he couldn't control the speed as well as the others that we saw who used it later. And while we haven't seen that much of Lafitte in combat just yet, I would bet my house that this dude is going to be obscenely fast as well. I mean, we have the fact that he's a tap dancer and an infiltrator type, so it kinda lines up already. And yet again, that matches well with Brook, who is so fast people don't even notice he cut them half the time. I mean, just imagine the sight of these two guys having like a duet at light speed while they battle. I mean, it'd probably be hard to follow in the manga, but it would still look pretty hype, I think. But alright, before I dive into the rest of the fight itself and how their awakenings might come into play, I want to run through a couple more options for what bird zone Lafitte may have. Because if we assume that his bird zone powers are tied to how he was able to have a second life or what have you, whether from a fake death or maybe even a legitimate one, then we should maybe look at birds that are tied to reincarnation or rebirth, of which there are several. But the most popular one, and one you probably thought of right away, is the phoenix. And just in case you don't know, the legend of this creature is pretty simple. When it dies, it's then reborn from its own ashes. But obviously, Marco already has this fruit, so we know that Lafitte can't have this one. However, I still think it's really important to talk about that just a little bit, because Marco does pair parallel Lafitte in one important way thanks to something I mentioned at the very start of the video, which is that Lafitte is Blackbeard's chief of staff, because that is usually the title for an organization's number 2, and Marco was definitely Whitebeard's right-hand man as his 1st Division captain. Now, Lafitte is the 5th Titanic captain, so those don't necessarily match, but personally, I put a lot more weight on the chief of staff part anyway, because there's gotta be a lot of trust involved with that decision. And I also think it goes without saying that Whitebeard and Blackbeard's crews are already sort of diametrically opposed in general. I mean, even the name Whitebeard and Blackbeard are opposites. The fact Blackbeard is responsible for several of their crew's deaths, Teach has the Quake Fruit now, and they won the Payback War, etc. So if both Whitebeard's and Blackbeard's number 2 have mythical bird zones, and one is the Phoenix, then doesn't it already kind of line up that Lafitte would also have a bird tied to rebirth? And if you think that having a mythical zone that allows you to actually reincarnate after death is a bit too broken, I would honestly probably agree with you, but we've kind of seen this before already with Baron Tamago, who kind of has a bird zone, although technically it's an egg zone because the way it works is that he dies, turns into an egg yolk, then grows into a chicken, dies, turns into another egg yolk, grows into another chicken, dies, turns into another egg yolk, turns into Baron Tamago, and then this cycle just kind of repeats endlessly in a cycle of death and rebirth, tying to that age-old question of if the chicken came before the egg. And the only way to kill him is to damage the embryo in between transformations. But the important thing here is that Oda is yet again tying the idea of resurrection to bird abilities in the One Piece story. So I really don't think it's that hard to believe that Lafitte might have some kind of special mythical zone fruit that would have let him come back from the dead, or maybe survive a deadly disease, or some kind of thing that saved him from actually dying permanently. I mean, hell, Luffy technically died on the rooftop and then came back and awakened his fruit, so we already have kind of seen this before. Now, as for potential options outside of the Phoenix, there are quite a few birds that are associated with the afterlife across a number of different cultures, like the red cardinal, crows, ravens, or blue heron, but many of these are clearly not usually depicted with white feathers like Lafitte has, so let's instead focus on 2 potential options, with the first one being a dove, which you often see released at funerals almost as like an escort to the afterlife. But specifically, I think Lafitte's fruit could be based on the Caladrius, or Caladrius, I don't know, which isn't 100% known to be a dove, but that's just kind of one of the ongoing theories for it. But basically, this is a snow-white bird from Roman mythology that was said to live in the king's house, which could already be a connection to Lafitte, because the first time we met him, where was he? Marijois, where the leaders of the world live. But also, what I think is really important is that this bird was said to be able to take sickness from others into itself, fly away, and then disperse that sickness so that both of them survived. And the reason I think that is really important is, yet again, connecting it back to Brook, that's how his crew died. Remember, his captain originally got sick, and that's how Brook took over, and they had to send the captain away. But then after that, they got attacked by other pirates, and they all got poisoned. And because of that poison, they all died, and Brook was the only one who was able to come back. So again, tying this to Lafitte, what if Lafitte got really sick in the past, potentially from losing to Brook or losing to whoever back in the day, and maybe that's how he even got pale, but then this fruit was able to take that sickness away, so he was able to survive. So I think something like that could make a lot of sense just because it mirrors Brook's backstory so well. But the other option, that I admittedly like a bit more, is the owl. This bird has been tied with death in a lot of different cultures across the globe, and it's also nocturnal, which just sort of fits the Blackbeard theme, I feel like. Plus, we have some mythological owls that may fit the bill for a mythical zone. And what's kind of ironic about this, and kind of reassuring for me personally, is that I scripted this video and came to the conclusion that it was an owl before I went back and rewatched that video by Hidden Island that I mentioned earlier, and he actually concurs with me that it is an owl. And the one that he specifically mentioned was the Strix. And so I highly encourage you guys to go check out the way that he broke it down, but I'm going to go ahead and co-sign it and explain why this bird would be the perfect zone to go against Brook. So the nitty-gritty on the Strix is that he's based on a classical European myth who signifies ill omen, and he can also shapeshift, and he fed on human flesh and blood. He's also usually described with grayish-white wings in classical literature. It's like a bloodthirsty monster in bird form, and with Lafitte being known as overly violent as Sheriff in the West Blue, it sounds pretty good already. This fruit could be what allowed him to alter his appearance so that nobody knows who he really is. And if it truly is the case that Lafitte actually died like like Brook did, but came back to life, I could see that being just the result of the awakening of this fruit. Because like I said with Luffy, he died on the rooftop and we learned that his fruit was actually a zone, and then he came back to life in an awakened form. This has led to a lot of theories that dying may be a prerequisite for awakening a zone fruit. I mean, we also never saw Kaido awaken in the Wano arc, at least not confirmed, and a very common theory has been that the reason Kaido wanted to die so bad was to actually awaken that fruit. That's why he was waiting for Joy Boy. He couldn't awaken until he lost. And another potential example is Pell, who we all thought died in Alabasta, but apparently didn't, and he somehow survived that nuke. And we're all kind of wondering how that could even be possible, other than just, you know, the Oda Oda no Mi. But I always wondered if maybe the bomb did kill him, thus triggering an awakening, but again, as we've seen with Luffy, might give him almost like a round 2. I mean, we already know that awakened zones become more durable and have faster recovery speed, so it would almost kind of line up to get a second crack at it after you die. But the trick to that is that your will also has to align with the fruit, because if you go back to what Shaka said in Egghead, usually awakened zones overwhelm the user's minds, like we saw with the Jailer Beast of Impel Down. But since Lafitte is a violent individual, I'm sure he could control the awakening of the Strix fruit, and that very thing may be what gave him another chance in the first place. But the reason that I would particularly love the Strix fruit against a fight versus Brook is that the Strix is known to eat human flesh and blood, which won't help him against a man who doesn't have any. This situation is ripe for all the puns that Brook has been giving us since his introduction, and could maybe even give him some small advantage compared to the others in this fight, especially when you factor in the hypnosis abilities, whether those come from the zone form or not, because Brook also doesn't even have eyes to look at Lafitte with to even be hypnotized. Plus, if owls are often the symbol of death, then who better to face off against that than a guy who could easily be mistaken for the Grim Reaper, potentially one of the most common symbols of death ever. And I'm also sure that by this point in the story, Brook would also have awakened his devil fruit, which adds an entire other layer to this battle. Now, this is something I have talked about in a few different videos before, so I'm gonna keep it short and sweet and just say that I think Brook's awakening is gonna let him almost create homies like Big Mom did, because we know that paramecia powers let you affect your surroundings. It's like you share your powers with the environment temporarily. And if the basis of Brook's fruit is reviving or even controlling his own soul, then I think it kind of makes sense to let him imbue that into whatever is around him. He can put some of his soul into things just like Big Mom already does, although she usually uses other people's soul to do so. But I think the advantage for Brook using his own soul is that he could maybe then use his music to power those homies up, instead of killing them like he did to Big Mom's chest keepers. So then his final battle versus Lafitte can almost be like a concert in a similar way to how it was against Big Mom for a little while. And if Brook is able to manipulate the environment into homies, or even one giant homie to be honest, it could provide a really good chance for Lafitte to show off his speed that I was talking about earlier, or his tap dancing abilities I guess, to avoid all of the attacks from those homies, meaning that this whole battle could be like a giant song and dance between the two, which may be the most fitting final battle for Brook that I could think of. And also, if that wacky theory I mentioned earlier is true, that Brook and Lafitte's home countries opposed one another as like the musicians and the dancers, this could all really hit home in a major way. But hey, that's it for this video guys. If you made it all the way to the end, I want to give you a massive thank you, and if you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing, because there are still 3 more Blackbeard vs Straw Hat videos that I have to cover, and if you want to see any of my past ones, then click this playlist right here. Or if you've seen all of those, maybe head over to my second channel where I now do long-form podcast-style discussions about One Piece with other creators, and there's quite a few over there now, so maybe you'll find one that you like. But until next time, later.